The first thing that needs to be noted here is everything that we have is God's. That includes every dime we make. We only make that through the blessing of God on our life. And so this gets into the financial stewardship side of things according to how the Bible lays it out. And we have to remember that you and I can argue all we want to over what we purchase. But in all reality, that money was God's before it was ours.
Yeah,
He gave that to us. And so that's why it's so important that we need to go back and pray about what we do spend the money on before we even both decide, let's talk about this and figure out where this money's going. This week on Connecting the Gap, we are starting off a brand new law in the 4 laws of love. We're going to be talking about the law of partnership. We'll be back with that right after this. Welcome once again to Connecting the Gap podcast. I'm Daniel Moore, your host. Thank you guys for joining us this week. We've been doing an extensive series on marriage here over the last couple of months. So once again, I have my wife, Michelle, sitting in here with us today, and she's going to be helping us get through another episode. This is a podcast about marriage. We do Bible and book studies, and we also have interviews with people that have a story. And we thank you guys for joining us this week. If you're not familiar with our show, you can check out our website at www.connectingthegap.net. All of our platforms are there, YouTube and Rumble links. We are also on the Christian podcasting app Edify. You can also visit us on social at facebook.com/CTGapOnline. If you're a fan of our show, please subscribe. Feel free to leave a comment on our platforms and give us a thumbs up or a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We'd be eternally grateful to you for doing that. Also wanted to let you guys know that we are on Instagram at this point as well. So all of you Instagram users out there, if you search for CT Gap Online, we are on Instagram, and we're using that to share our episodes out and our daily posts that we try to do daily. Sometimes they're not every day, but the posts that go out are now being sent to Instagram as well. So just another way to reach more people with our podcast. Well, this week, as I said in the intro, we're going to be talking about the law of partnership. And over this series here, we've been talking about different ways that husbands and wives, how spouses need to work together, how they need to be cohesive with each other throughout the relationships, be transparent and open. And one important aspect of being a husband and a wife in a relationship is you have to be partners. And we're going to be talking about that this week on Connecting the Gap.
And they shall become one flesh. The passage from Genesis 2:24 mentioned previously is a clear allusion to sexual intimacy. As stated in 1 Corinthians 6:16, engaging in sexual relations with someone of the opposite sex results in a deep physical and spiritual connection. The verse in Corinthians serves as a caution from the Apostle Paul to the morally corrupt Christians in Corinth, advising them against engaging in promiscuity with prostitutes. Paul referred to this act as a violation of one's own body. In addition to the literal interpretation of becoming one flesh through sexual intercourse, Genesis 2:24 outlines a principle of marriage that extends to all aspects of life. We refer to this as the law of partnership. This principle is crucial for building trust and intimacy in a relationship. By comprehending and following this principle, we will encounter a profound level of unity and connection within the marriage. Yet, if we inadvertently violate this principle, it can have a damaging impact on trust and closeness in this relationship. To grasp the full significance and consequences of the law of partnership within marriage, it is important to recognize this fundamental truth. Marriage is a comprehensive union where all previously individual possessions and responsibilities are now collectively owned and managed. There are no exceptions to this rule. Anything in a marriage that is not willingly shared with the other person remains outside the partnership, resulting in justified feelings of legitimate jealousy. The concept of becoming one flesh encompasses more than just physical intimacy. It involves merging all possessions and associations of two individuals into a unified entity that is jointly owned and managed. If a spouse is unwilling to integrate certain aspects into the partnership, they are violating the law of partnership and infringing upon the other spouse's rights. To gain a complete understanding of God's intention for unity in marriage, it is essential to examine Paul's teachings on sex and the marital bond in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. In this section, Paul not only expands on his earlier remarks from chapter 6, but provides a more thorough explanation of them. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife.
And so as we come into this week's episode talking about partnership, it brings up to my memory something that I like to joke about a lot. And I know a lot of you guys out there have probably heard it as well. But when people will ask, well, do you and your wife get along? How's everything go between you two? And you're like, yeah, it goes great. What's hers is hers and what's mine is hers. And you know how that joke goes. And
that's right.
And you know what?
Learned it well.
The bad problem about that is there are couples out there that really believe that. And that's the issue. And in all reality, that has to remain just being a joke, because when you are in a partnership, one person does not have the right to keep things from the other one.
That's right.
In any aspect of their marriage, regardless if it's intimate, if it's belongings, money, that's a big one. And we'll talk about that a little bit today. But there's so many areas that if you're going to be in an actual partnership, so I look at this kind of like owning a business. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I start this business and I can't do it on my own. So I bring in an outside person. We'll just even take this away from the spouse. I bring in a best friend of mine, and he sews in 50% into that business. Well, we become partners. Now, if I'm the one keeping the books and I'm sitting there doing all the financials or whatever, and then he comes up and says, hey, what's our profit margins looking like right now? How are things going? And I look at him and say, well, that's my business. You don't need to know about any of that. You just go do what you do and sell or whatever, and I'll take care of that. I would have to believe that partnership's probably not going to last very long because both people that are in that partnership relationship in that business have full right to know every aspect of that business and what's going on, what's taking place, where you are financially. Because in essence, what ends up happening if you're not careful is that's how people start bilking money off the books. I mean, they start padding numbers here and there and hiding stuff. And if the other person doesn't know the details of all of that, then it's real easy for it to be a lopsided relationship at that point. And just like that partnership between me and my friend in that business, there's probably no way that would last for an eternity, because we're going to clash eventually. And it's probably going to be a separation there and lose a friendship. Yeah. Probably. And that same aspect takes place in marriage.
Yeah. And as you're talking about that, I think sometimes personalities come in that, because you have passive personalities that if you have a partnership in the business and they're like, oh, you just do whatever you need to, I trust you, and even in a relationship, hey, I love you, you just do whatever you need to, I'm good. Yeah. But then is that really right?
Yeah. And we're going to be talking, we got some examples we're going to be sharing today from some different aspects in marriage that we're going to talk about to kind of give some clarity on how we can make some mistakes in these partnerships. So as Michelle, as she was reading here and starting out, as Paul was talking about in 1 Corinthians, about the husband's supposed to fulfill his marital duty to his wife and likewise wife to her husband. Well, if you considered Paul's instruction regarding the possession of our bodies within the context of the marriage, he emphasizes the transition in ownership and management of our physical selves from individual control to shared ownership and management with our spouses. So now, a caveat here, this does not condone any form of abuse by any means, but it highlights the necessity of a complete partnership in order for unity to be achieved within marriage. This encompasses all aspects, including our bodies. So I guess in the little joke that I said earlier, the best way to say that is what's yours is mine and what's mine is yours. That's how that really needs to go.
Yeah.
Because I shouldn't be withholding anything from my side from you.
Right.
And vice versa. You know, we should be open and very...
I think I like the first part, though.
You like to, especially if it's on your side?
That's right.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Sorry.
But it's a good thing we live biblically.
I know.
Right? But the reality is, though, unfortunately, probably more often than not, there's couples out there living in a backwards relationship. There's one holding on to so much and hiding things from the other spouse.
We were there.
Yeah, and it's not biblical. That's not how God made this to work.
Right.
Failure to engage in mutual ownership and management in all areas of the relationship can definitely result in division and problems, just like my example with the business. Each aspect of the partnership that we willingly surrender for joint ownership and management contributes to the cultivation of trust and intimacy in the marriage. So as we get started, we're going to go through 4 different illustrations here, 4 examples to illustrate the results and consequences when the law of partnership is violated. And these are true stories, by the way. So that kind of adds a little bit more of an interest level to this, but the names have been changed in these stories.
And remember, this comes from the book, The 4 Laws of Love by Jimmy Evans.
Yes. And so I'm going to read the first one here, and we'll talk about it, and then we'll go through the other 3 here as we get to them. So in example number 1, Fred desired to be intimate and enjoy sex, but Marilyn would not participate when he did something that angered her. Then she would tell him, "I am going to cut you off for a week if you do that again." And she meant it. Fred and Marilyn came to Jimmy Evans' office when the problems in their relationship grew to the point that they were on the verge of separation. Fred resented Marilyn because she was aware of his strong sex drive and used her body as a means to punish and manipulate him. In other words, Marilyn used sex to control her husband and their marriage. Not only did she cut Fred off when he misbehaved, but she also bargained for things with sex. Fred angrily related to me an incident concerning a budget they had established to help work out their tight financial situation. Both had agreed to honor their plan and to limit their spending. One day, Marilyn saw a dress she wanted, but knew buying it would throw off their budget. After agonizing over the issue for a while, she confronted Fred and asked to buy the dress anyway. Well, Fred politely said no, and he explained why. Well, immediately, Marilyn began to bargain seductively. "Fred, if you'll let me buy that dress, I will let you have sex twice a day for the next week." Well, you might think that this scenario would be any man's dream, but you would be mistaken. Although Fred admitted to playing the bargains for sex game for a while, and he described his feelings this way: "Why can't Marilyn have sex with me because she loves me and wants me, or at least because she loves me and wants me to be happy and satisfied? Why does sex have to be a weapon or a bargaining chip to get her own way? I have come to resent sex with Marilyn because I feel she withholds her body from me and does not understand or honor my sexual needs. While there are times of the month when a woman's body may not be available for intercourse, a woman should never communicate to her husband that her body does not belong to him in an unqualified manner to meet his sexual needs. Of course, this does not mean or even imply that a man may sexually abuse his wife by physical force or through emotional pressure make her do something that violates the word of God or her conscience. It does mean exactly, though, what the Apostle Paul expressed. In marriage, our bodies no longer belong exclusively to us. We must give them to our spouses for the purpose of mutual sexual satisfaction. 2 brief statements should be made here before we go on to the second example. The first thing that we need to point out here about this story emphatically is that this principle works both ways. It's just as true for husbands as it is for wives. There's been many wives that have complained that they want more sex than their husbands, but they are uninterested and unwilling to participate. It's just as wrong for a husband to do this as it is for a wife, because in both cases, the law of partnership is being violated and the marriage will suffer as a result. And secondly, hopefully you've recognized by now the essential role trust plays within marriage. Trust is the foundation that promotes and protects the ability to give oneself and one's body unconditionally to a spouse. Every person should ask this question before marriage. Can I trust this person completely with every area of my life? Unless the answer is yes, you will have difficulty giving yourself to that person. If you cannot give yourself to your partner completely, at some point they will feel violated. Therefore, the issue of trust is of major importance to the success of every marriage. So here in this first scenario that we share here, as we started the episode, Michelle was reading, so that definitely violates Corinthians, correct?
Yep.
I mean, Paul was specifically stating that, and he even put this in the sexual aspect when he actually wrote this scripture, that whenever we become married, and we've talked about this several times throughout this podcast, that guys have needs that women don't.
Right.
And women have needs that guys don't.
Right.
And so it's real easy probably for this scenario to happen where you start dangling it like a carrot in front of somebody and say, okay, well, if you do this, this is your reward, you know? And it's probably real easy to do that in a marriage because we are so different.
Yeah.
And a lot of times if the spouse, the wife is not in the mood, but the man is, and, they don't get together and make that happen, if that becomes a normal scenario on a regular basis, then that's where that division starts to happen. And I know in our marriage, back especially when we were getting into the point where we were starting to have a lot of problems, that's probably one of the very first areas that we probably did cut off from each other a lot more was the sexual side.
Yeah.
And whenever that happened, how'd that make you, which I know we had issues. And so kind of talk about a little bit. So whenever that happened with us, it's because we were angry with each other.
Right.
We were starting to head down that slope that we should not have went down. So do you feel like from your side of it, was it your way to punish me? Or was it just a change in your perception of our marriage and you just had no desire?
I think it was both. I think there was times that I did it just simply because you made me mad. And I was like, this is a way to get back. Was it right? No, it wasn't. And the other time, it was just something that I didn't want to do. Like, it was like, just me, myself. It was not in the right mindset.
Yeah. So
it's like withholding from you. I think it went both ways, actually. For me, how about you?
Yeah, that division, we were angry back and forth. It's hard to be intimate when you're upset with someone and really mean it. Well,
and I think part of it, too, is when you're not talking or communicating, you're not going to work through it.
Yeah.
And when you're not going to work through it, you can't have that relation with each other to make up.
Right. And that also brings up a little bit too, and this may come up again later. I don't know for sure because I haven't gotten that far out there. But if you do get into it with each other, and we did talk about this a little bit once because I remember you don't use sex to make up for it.
Right.
Now, people do it.
Yeah.
We've done it.
Yeah.
I'm sure everybody's probably done it in a marriage. But in all reality, that did not fix the problem.
Right. That's the reason why communication is very, very important. Yeah. I think any time that this is the way I feel now, just simply because, we don't really fight or argue or anything. We've been through so much and we know where we're at. But I would say back then, right when we were trying to work things out, if we couldn't talk it through, we just didn't have sex.
Yeah.
That was something until we figured out, like, okay, how are we going to work this through? We didn't let our emotions or our feelings get the best of us.
Yeah.
We loved each other, but you have to be careful with that because emotionally or physically attached to you, you have to have that communication to work out those problems and bring God into it. Then I think at that point in time, you're doing it for the right reasons.
Right.
You know?
And that's very important, because the next thing I was going to say as you were talking there is God created the sexual intimacy part of marriage for a purpose. Making up after a fight was not that purpose.
No.
That is one of the most intimate things that a couple can share. That is the most intimate thing.
Yeah.
That a couple can. That's why you don't go to the prostitutes.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's why you don't bring the third people into the triangles and the quadruples and the swapping, all the stuff that happens nowadays that Satan enjoys.
Yeah.
That is not God's purpose for the sexual part of our marriage. And God knew from the very beginning, because of the way that he created us as human beings, that we were going to have a struggle with the sexual side of our relationships, and that it was going to be real easy to be tempted by people outside of the marital bond, and there was going to be issues there. And I think that's why he specifically spent time in the Word explaining that, hey, when you're married, everything belongs to both of you, and your bodies are included in that. Nobody else has any business being in the middle of that. So let's go ahead now and go ahead and read example number 2.
Okay, at my first meeting with LC and LaDonna, they seemed to be a young couple with everything going for them. They were both sweet, God-fearing people, but they had a serious problem, a wedge that was deeply dividing their marriage. LaDonna had received an inheritance from her father who had died recently, but LC controlled the finances. At first, she did all the talking, describing her deep resentment toward her husband. My father died last year and left me $65,000, she told me. As Elsie looked uncomfortably toward the floor when we received it, I knew I needed to share it with Elsie, and I did. As she continued, her voice began to break and tears streamed down her face. When we got the inheritance check from my father's estate, Elsie spent half of the money on a new truck for himself without even asking what I thought. He then put the other half in investments. I felt betrayed, she said in a trembling voice as she reached toward the box of tissues on the coffee table in front of her. After a short and awkward silence, LaDonna concluded her remarks with this statement. I didn't mind him getting a truck, and I know we needed to put some in investments, but 2 things really bothered me. First, Elsie never even asked me what I wanted to do with the money. He simply took possession of it as if it were all his. Second, I have told him several times I want to take a few $1,000s and fix up our house. After buying the truck and investing the rest, he told me we didn't need to fix up the house because the kids were still young and we couldn't afford it right now. That was more than I could take. With the gauntlet obviously thrown toward LC, he offered this defense. Well, I know she's upset just because I wouldn't let her buy the furniture and stuff she wanted, but I just didn't think it was a practical right then. Every time I tried to talk to her about the situation, she got emotional like she is now, and I couldn't reason with her. For the next 30 minutes, I explained 2 things to LC. First, the way he had spent the inheritance money showed LaDonna very clearly that he had taken sole possession of it and did not care about her opinions or desires. Although it came from her father, he did not ask her for advice, and what little she offered was ignored. I told him that everything they owned was a joint possession that was supposed to be administered as a couple. I explained to him that his dominant, insensitive behavior was completely to blame for their current situation, and that the solution for him to repent to LaDonna and to begin to treat her with respect. Second, I explained to Elsie how important a woman's home is to her. When he denied his wife's request to fix up the house, he was effectively saying to her, I really don't care about your world. I have my truck and my world is doing great. He obviously wrestled with the advice I gave him that day, but finally he agreed to pray about the situation and to discuss it again with LaDonna. Later, she told me everything had been worked out and they were getting along much better. Oh, I think I would be mad.
Good old finances.
Yes, and I feel like, when I was reading this, that seems to be a situation, I think, in a lot of marriages. I mean, I know it was for us. When you have finances, or if you have someone that's in charge of finances and they do what they want to do, but not take in consideration of what the other spouse, you are going to feel, you're going to feel like it's one-sided, self-absorbed. And, it's not something that I would not want that done to me.
Yep.
And you wouldn't want that done to you.
No.
I mean, we discuss everything we buy. It's funny, if I go somewhere and I want something, I mean, Dan's not like, you can't buy anything, like by any means or anything like that. But if it's something that's going to be rather large or something, I will text him like, hey, I found this. What do you think? What's your thoughts? Should we buy this? Because in reality, Dan does do our finances. He knows much more than I do because I don't have time and he really doesn't have time. And even though I work somewhere that I can see that all the time, he just does a better job at it. And he's more detailed and he keeps it in his brain much better than I do. But he will tell me, hey, if you think it's what you want and you know where we're at in our finances, go for it, And then there's been times like, hey, this has come up, don't spend this money, and thank goodness we have a savings and stuff like that. But larger purchases, I know Dan would like to buy his dream truck. I mean, and I've told him, like, go get it, but we also want to be smart with our money. And I think anybody should be praying about anything. And I know a couple that the husband went and bought something rather large and didn't tell his wife until he came home and then told her. And she's kind of passive. So she was like, oh, okay, and it didn't turn out well for him. And I think it's very important that, you guys pray together when it comes to this, especially a large inheritance. It needs to be prayed about before.
Yep.
I mean, how do you feel about it?
Well, the first thing that needs to be noted here is everything that we have is God's. Mm-hmm. And that includes every dime we make. We only make that through the blessing of God on our life. And so
that's good.
This gets into the financial stewardship side of things, according to how the Bible lays it out. And we have to remember that you and I can argue all we want to over what we purchase. Mm-hmm. But in all reality, that money was God's before it was ours.
Yeah,
He gave that to us. And so that's why it's so important that we need to go back and pray about what we do spend the money on before we even both decide, let's talk about this and figure out where this money's going. Now, there's two scenarios out there that I want to talk about real quick here that's very, very common in couples, and they're very dangerous places to be. The first one is the couple that has the one spouse that handles all of the finances, and they're the ones that put all the money in the different places or whatever. And there's a lot of people out there that will hide money in different accounts and not tell the other spouse that it's there. And that is completely 100% wrong. And the reason that I say that is, if that spouse ever passes away that knows where all of this money's located and the other spouse has no clue that this money is there.
Well, you're hiding it.
You're hiding it. You're hiding it from them. You're not being honest, and you're showing that other spouse, just like in this situation here, you're showing that other spouse that, you know what, you don't matter in this. No. There's no reason for you to know what's going on. I've got this. It's all about me. Me. That just radiates out of that whole scenario. And that is not how God intended that. Every penny that Michelle and I make, so I have a business on the side plus my normal job, and then Michelle has her job where she makes her income. Every penny that we make, we both know exactly where they're at. And it's not just because Michelle works at a bank. I mean, even if she didn't work at the bank, we would still know where all of our money is located because that's both of our money.
Yeah.
I didn't make all of it and she didn't make all of it. We both have equal right to that money, but we also have equal responsibility to be financial steward-like in spending that money according to God's plan in the Bible.
Right.
So that comes back to that. Now, you've got the other couples where the one spouse does all the finances and knows all the ins and outs of the money and all that, and the other spouse could care less.
Yep.
They're just like, well, he's got it or she's got it. That's all that matters. I don't need, you ask them, well, how much money's in your account right now? I don't know. I mean, go ask him. He's the one that does all of that. That's probably, I don't want to say that that's wrong, but that's dangerous. That's a very dangerous place to be because, again, that opens up another avenue for some dishonesty, or that opens up another avenue for some temptation there for that other spouse to maybe, well, she doesn't really pay attention to what I'm doing, so I think I'm going to open up another account over here and just shove a little over to the side or whatever and not tell her or not tell him. And so that puts another situation where that could create a problem eventually in those marriages. And so I know everybody out there has their own ways of how they handle their finances in their marriages. And I don't want to say there's not a right and a wrong because there is a right. Financially, if you're having problems financially and you just cannot fix it, there are good ministries out there like Dave Ramsey, and there's MoneyWise, Financial Issues. There's different places that you can go to, and they can help you get a handle on that. But this is a big reason that divorces happen, is with the finances. That becomes a huge issue sometimes between couples. And when you have this situation like what we just shared here, where one spouse controls every bit of it and does not really care about the other spouse's wants, but yet they're okay blowing the money on their big ticket items, that's a great recipe for a divorce if you're not careful. And you'll end up in, doing marriage counseling or whatever. That's where that road's headed. And so definitely you got to be careful with that. But the first and foremost thing to remember is everything we have belongs to God.
Yep.
It does not matter. This whole home and everything in this home that Michelle and I live in isn't really ours. It belongs to God first. And it's up to us to give God the glory for all of that in the way that we handle our finances and the way that we handle our situation. We're giving glory back to God when we do that the biblical way.
Right.
And God will bless you for that.
Yep.
Tremendously.
Absolutely.
So just keep that in mind when it comes to this financial thing. Both spouses need to know what's going on. They both need to be aware. They both need to know where all the accounts are at. They need to know where all the money's located. They need to be transparent with each other on where that money's being spent. They need to confide in each other when they're spending that money. There's just a lot of things there to make sure that to actually fulfill this law of partnership. Again, that comes back to the thing I talked about earlier with starting a business with my friend. Me and him's not a partner if I'm not sharing financially where that business is at and I'm hiding money from him. That blows that partnership thing out the door. That at that point, that becomes I'm the boss.
Right.
And he's my lowly employee that doesn't need to know nothing. And that's not how that works. And so just keep that in mind when it comes to this financial stuff in marriages, because this is a very touchy, tricky subject to try to navigate through. The third example here, Greg and Tamara both had been married previously, and Tamara had 2 children from her prior marriage. They were seeking counseling, however, not for the sake of their own relationship, but because Greg and her children were not getting along. This is a common scenario that causes significant problems in marriages where one or both spouses have had previous marriages. Both of them were warm, intelligent people who had been attracted to each other because they complemented each other very well. They were both so articulate and polished, it was difficult at first to determine the seriousness of their situation. Unfortunately, Greg and Tamara ended up getting a divorce rather than solving the problem because Tamara would not share the ownership and control of her biological children with Greg. And you might say, well, but the children weren't Greg's. Their father was Tamara's previous spouse. Well, that is true. However, once Greg and Tamara married, the children became part of the new household where Greg was their resident, quote-unquote, father. As Greg confided during a counseling session, he felt that his rights had been violated in 2 different ways. First of all, he felt Tamara did not trust him enough with their children to allow him to correct them or give input in their lives. She responded by saying they had been hurt enough by the divorce from their father, and she was only trying to protect them. Still, Greg could not understand how she could trust her own life to him, but not the lives of her children. With all of the right intentions, Tamara was violating the law of partnership. Even though Greg wasn't the biological father of her children, she still had to share possession of her children with him, and he had to be a partner in raising them. Regarding disciplining stepchildren, it is best for the biological parent to be the enforcer of the discipline, especially when the marriage is new. However, the step-parent must be an equal in decision-making. They must share possession of all children and must have an equal say in all decisions related to them. Secondly, Greg felt violated by the way Tamara's children treated him. Knowing he had no authority over them, they were disrespectful and disobeyed him constantly. When confronted by their mother about their treatment of Greg, the children would instinctively accuse him of wrongdoing and try to pit their mother and Greg against each other. And it worked. Caught between her children's confused feelings and Greg's legitimate frustrations, Tamara chose her children and divorced Greg. And I have lots of experience with all of this in a couple of different places.
It's kind of funny because when we decided how we were going to read these, he hadn't read them yet.
Well, I had, but it had been a while, so I couldn't remember what they were.
He goes, I'll read 1 and 3, and you read 2 and 4. And I'm like looking at it, and I'm looking at 3, and I'm like, oh, you're going to love that one. I'm like, you know this one. This one hits you just right.
Yeah, and this can be a huge issue.
Yeah.
So let's go back even before we got married. My dad got divorced, and then he got remarried to his second wife. They met online, and she lived in New York. And when they got married and she moved here, she had 2 kids, and 2 of those kids was a son and a daughter, and they were the age of my younger siblings. And they were married 6 months, if they made it 6 months. And the kids caused all of that for the most part, because as soon as they moved in, my siblings, I was older then, I was upper teenage years, so I was on the verge of being out of the house anyway. But my younger siblings and her 2 kids clashed, and the war was on. And needless to say, this where they talk about pitting the mother against the father in this story, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And
I remember that.
Eventually, it caused a huge division between my dad and his wife at that time. I'm not going to say her name, but they ended up divorced. He got an annulment. Yeah. That's exactly where it went.
And she moved back.
Yep, she moved back where she came from. Yeah. And, don't think this isn't real. Don't think that this can't happen. I know when you get married and you bring kids into a split family.
Blended families are hard.
It is hard.
It's tough.
And kids can make or break your marriage.
Yeah.
It may be nothing to do with you and your spouse. You two may get along great and think this is the best thing ever, but your kids can go behind your back, especially if they're old enough. They can go behind your back and they can create huge issues. Now, when Michelle and I got married, I had 1 child at the time. Michelle had 2. And so we brought our blended family together as well. And this would be a whole other episode on its own. But there was some behavioral issues there with some of the kids, and it clashed with my personality. And, at one point in time, I had a nickname Sergeant because I was so, tough on the kids, according to the outside family members and whatever. That's the nickname that they gave me. And, looking back, I do see where I was difficult and hard on our kids a lot of times when I should have handled it differently. I grew up a certain way, and I allowed that to articulate how I became a parent. Mm-hmm. And I should not have done that because, in all reality, the way that I grew up really wasn't quite right either. But I let that, that showed me how to be a parent later, and that's what I did. Yeah. That's how I parented. And I honestly hadn't been with any kids because when my daughter was born, I was divorced by the time she was 1. Mm-hmm. And so I have been in the every other weekend thing my whole daughter's life. I never really lived with my daughter. And so I hadn't really had a chance to be a full-blown parent anyway. Mm-hmm. And I'd been single for 5 years and doing this back and forth thing. And so when Michelle and I got married and she moved in and all of a sudden I've got a house full of kids, I'm an instant dad.
There was 2.
Well, there was 3. Well, yeah, Brick was still back and forth.
House full of kids.
But still, you're dealing with the other
spouse
still.
Yeah.
I mean, as they always say, when you get divorced, you're not really divorced. You're just married to 2 people. That's pretty much how that works. Yep. And one gets the perks, and the other one gets the relationship. But yeah, it's one of those things where I did it wrong, and I've had to apologize to my kids. And that did cause some division between me and you. I don't really think it was the reason for our divorce necessarily.
No, I mean, I didn't like how you handled it. We never talked about it in front of the children. We always did it behind doors, but, and I feel like, you should never discipline a child when you're angry or you're upset. You need to make sure that you understand if you're angry, you're going to take it out on them by raising your voice or something like that. But I feel like, you recognized it later down the road. And I think, God changed that. I mean, I think a lot of it, I was shocked when we had 2 little foster kids and you treated them so much better than you treated our children. But I think by then you had learned what you had done wrong. But you're right. You went back and apologized to our children.
Yeah.
And, it's mended. They still feel like, as kids, as I think if you go back and ask any kid,
they'll give you their opinion.
Yeah, they'll give you your opinion. I was B, and I was this, and it's like, you got a spanking. That's not being beaten. That's, you got a spanking, And I think, for spanking too, don't spank when you're angry, But I think when I read this, I was kind of laughing because I was just like, oh, well,
Yeah.
I mean, I really do feel like it is, when you remarry someone in a blended family, you have to take in consideration your children, the stepchildren, how you're going to discipline, whether it's together. And I love how the fact that Pastor Jimmy Evans talked about this and disciplining and, the decision making.
Yep.
I by no way was really the one to emphasize the discipline because my son wouldn't listen to me. So that's when Dan stepped in. But again, like Dan said, he brought in his childhood, how he was raised into it. And we really struggled sometimes when it came to discipline.
We got in lots of fights over it.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. But again, we didn't let the kids know it in front of them.
Right.
That's one thing that I do appreciate, the fact that we took that behind closed doors.
Yeah. And so the key to it is what you said, don't react in anger. You've got to calm down and simmer down. And that was my problem, is I would approach the issue and try to correct it at the immediate moment it would happen, and it would tick me off. And so I'm already red-faced and fuming and smoke coming out of my ears when I'm going after the kids. And, they got the wrath of Daniel at that point. And that was not the correct way to do that. And that's a good way to make your kids hate you.
And I think, too, if you're going to be remarried and in a blended family, do counseling.
Yes.
I wish Dan and I would have known some of the sources out there and utilized them, because...
And not just the regular premarital counseling.
No,
you need to get the blended family counseling.
Yes. And it's good to know that is out there. So if you're in a blended family, seek out that counseling. I mean, we know someone that does that. If you are listening to this podcast and you need that, let us know. We can, have them reach out via phone or something, because it's so important. Your marriage is important.
Yes.
Blended families are difficult, and put God first, your husband, then your children. But it is good to go through a class to let you know how to navigate that.
Yeah. And we don't tell this very often, but you can go to my website, connectingthegap.net. There's a form there you can fill out, or you can email us at daniel@connectingthegap.net, and you can contact us if you're interested in that type of some counseling or whatever. Like Michelle said, we do know someone that offers that. Just one more thing here is before we move on to this last example is, like in my dad's situation, for instance, the way that he could have solved that problem, my dad should have taken control of his kids, and she should have taken control of hers. And if both of them would have put their foot down as parents and said, "Hey, we're married. This is going to work. We're going to have to fix this and get it figured out," then the chances would have risen tremendously. I think that it would have lasted.
Yeah.
But I think, again, my dad didn't get counseling. He just got remarried.
Yeah.
And that's the first time he had been remarried with, blended kids coming in. And a lot of times when you don't know it's a whole different world than the first marriage. And having your own kids, it's a completely different world. And there's so many more things that you're going to have to deal with. And so it'll catch you off guard if you're not careful. And it'll put you in a spot where you just don't know what to do. And then everything you do then is all a reaction.
Yeah.
And so then you start feeling flustered and don't know what to do. And then you're at each other's throats. And, the wife has her opinion of what you need to do. And the guy has his opinion of what you need to do. And they don't match. And you just start having this big blow up. But for parents, part of the parental side of this is you've got to be able to have control of your children and to discipline them in a godly manner. Let them know that we're the boss. We are married now. You guys are going to have to respect the other parent and let this relationship grow. Show lots of love. I mean, there's just going to be a lot of things there, but that's a whole different episode. I mean, we're not going to go any further with that. But so go ahead and read example 4.
This is Pastor Jimmy talking, so I just want to let you guys know. When Karen and I got married, we both had a lot of hurts from our past, but there was a big difference in our pain. Karen was willing to share hers with me, but I wasn't willing to share mine. Regarding her past, there was a door Karen wasn't willing to open to me. When we talked, she was very open and honest about everything she had been through that had created her pain. Even though it took years for the Lord to heal her, her transparency was courageous. I was different. Knowing the things I had been through while growing up, Karen had asked me many times to talk with her about them. I refused. I didn't know how to deal with the pain of certain incidents that occurred while I was a child and a teenager. So I didn't. I just denied they existed and stuffed the pain. The problem was my pain affected Karen in a very real way. In fact, it affected every relationship in my life. Silent pain radiates to everyone around it. As long as it hides in the darkness of denial and refuses to open up, it imprisons everyone around it in its icy grip. My breakthrough from pain began on the evening I agreed to talk with Karen openly. One of the first things she went for was my past. A lot of my pain came from an angry, absentee father. He was a workaholic. When he was at home, he was silent and didn't involve himself in my or my brother's lives. My father rarely talked. I could ask him any question and the response 99% of the time was, I don't know. He also never physically touched me from the time I was 3 years old to the time I was 38 years old at my grandmother's funeral. I was an athlete and invited my dad to come to every one of my games. He didn't come to one of them. Karen knew I was in pain, so on the first night when I told her I would answer her questions, she asked me about my dad not coming to any of my games. She asked me directly, Jimmy, when your dad didn't come to any of your games when you were growing up, didn't that hurt you? I quickly responded with, no, Karen, it really didn't. And then she said something to me I will never forget. She said, yes, Jimmy, it did hurt you, and it's the reason for a lot of your issues. I was shocked when she said that because I truly didn't know I was in pain. But that changed about 2 weeks later. I was praying and having my quiet time with the Lord one morning, and all of a sudden, He took me back to a memory when I played football in middle school. In my mind, I was standing in the game looking at the sidelines to see if my father was there. And of course, he wasn't. And what I remembered was that I used to pick out another boy's father who was present and pretend he was my dad. On that occasion, I chose the father of a friend of mine named Ross. He was a wonderful man, and any boy would have been proud to have him as a dad. He was at every game and vocally and enthusiastically supported his son. But many times without knowing it, he was my dad too. On the morning the memory came back to me, so did the pain. It was a rush of unbelievable anger, fury, and raw emotion. I didn't know what to do with it. With the help of the Lord and a good Christian counselor, I was able to forgive my father and receive healing for my past hurts. When my father pain was healed, I was a different person and a better husband and father. It would have never happened without me opening up to my wife. If you are in pain, then so is everyone around you, and especially your spouse. It doesn't matter who your pain is regarding, your spouse is negatively affected the most. The only way to prevent your pain from damaging your marriage is to share it with your spouse and let them have ownership of it. When I say you should share your pain, I don't mean you should angrily spew out everything bad as you've been through and every person who has hurt you. I mean you should open every door of pain in your life and allow God, your spouse, and godly people into them to help you heal and move forward. In some cases, there are spouses who didn't want to receive their partner's pain or have anything to do with it. If you are in that situation and are in pain, you need to open up to a spiritual leader or Christian counselor and let them help you resolve your past and receive healing. You might also consider asking your spouse to go to counseling with you so that they can be involved in the process. Regardless of whether they go with you or not, you can experience freedom in your life and move forward without dragging your past with you as you do. It will change you and your marriage for the better.
So this little story here pretty much speaks for itself. And I am fortunate because I didn't really have... Now, my dad worked a lot. And, he worked several jobs. So there was a lot of times that he was not able to attend things that we went to. But he was there occasionally, did do things with us as he could. And, that kind of thing. And I think, Michelle, you're pretty much probably the same. You played volleyball. Mm-hmm. Your parents came and watched.
My mom.
Yeah.
Yeah, my dad would show up occasionally.
Yeah, but he at least was able to be there when he could be. But I do know people that have parents that don't really have anything to do with the things that they do. I know parents that don't like the path that their kids took, so they refuse to go because it wasn't what they wanted them to do. A lot of times, especially when it comes to sports, a lot of fathers are really bad about this. If a father done sports when they were a kid and they really didn't do that well, they try to live out their sports fantasies through their children. And if their children take a different path and decide not to play sports and, do something different, get into show choir or something like that, well, all of a sudden the dad just doesn't want to be no part of it because that's not the kid I raised. You should be out there playing sports, and then they refuse to go to any of that. This is what happens. Mm-hmm. You can think it's not going to affect somebody all you want to.
But it does.
But in all reality, it does. Yep. It works on the psyche. It works on the individual person of who they are. And that person is trying to be the person that they feel like God created them to be.
Right.
And you're sitting here trying to reformulate them into something you want them to be. And that's not how that works.
Well, you don't live out your kids' life. You don't make your kids live out the life you want. Right.
And so as we close up this week here, this law of partnership really, again, just like the rest of these laws we've talked about, has no exception. Every facet of a thriving, successful marriage must adhere to this law of partnership. Failure to relinquish control and initiate joint ownership will result in a breach of the matrimonial connection. The subject in question is inconsequential. Marriage counselors, they'll draw upon numerous instances of couples facing substantial issues and ultimately separating due to their failure to comply with this law of partnership. It's caused many, many, many divorces. And I will say that with our marriage, I'm a very quiet type personality to an extent myself. And I know in our marriage, even when we were having problems, I didn't want to talk about them. I stayed quiet a lot and didn't discuss things. Yep. And that eventually caused issues. There was a time in our marriage up front there that you felt like you didn't even know who I was.
Nope.
You openly asked me a few times, Michelle would tell me, she's like, I feel like that there's something crazy in your background or history that you're just not, there's like a dark place that you've never told me about or something, because I didn't talk about stuff. I kept it all inside. And I've done that since I was a kid. And so I don't know what caused that, if it's just my personality or what. I try to do better now.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I don't do that anymore. But I think a lot of it, too, was the reflection of the problems we were going through. I didn't want to have to confront those and admit that we had an issue. Yeah. And I think there was just a lot of stuff going on there. It was easier for me to stay quiet and just not talk about it and hope that it went away.
Right.
And I think that's the attitude that I had about it. But in order that you will not think your spouse is being petty and unreasonably resentful when you withhold an area of your life from joint ownership and control, consider what Jesus said to those during a relationship with him. In Luke 14:33, it says, "In the same way, any of you who does not give up everything that he has cannot be my disciple." So when we put that in practical terms, Jesus does not expect us to eliminate all of our possessions in order to establish a connection with him. However, he requires us to surrender everything we possess to his authority. Otherwise, we cannot truly follow him. If there is any aspect of your life that you're unable or unwilling to yield to Jesus, then you're essentially prioritizing that over him, whether if you are consciously doing it or not. That's exactly what's taking place. The elements that we withhold from Jesus are viewed as idols in his eyes, and he refuses to compete with them. It is hurtful to him when we place greater importance on other entities or individuals, and when we struggle to entrust him with every aspect of our existence. Similarly, when you put this scripture into play in our lives, this principle also applies in our marriages. When there is something we possess that we are unwilling to disclose to our partners, it conveys a message that they hold lesser importance in our lives than that particular item. Furthermore, it suggests that we lack faith in their ability to handle that information together. This also brings up the perspective on prenuptial agreements. And Jimmy talks about that a little bit here. With prenuptial agreements, he's totally against those. And the reason for that is because when you do marry somebody else, in essence, you're entrusting yourself to that person once again, just like you did with your first spouse. You're entrusting yourself to that person. And so you should be able to openly share between each other and trust each other to not do something to take that away from the other spouse. Now, there is one caveat to this. He says that if you come into the marriage and you have tons and tons of estate built up and you're later on in life, he said there might be an issue where you might want to do that just to make sure that your children get what they're supposed to inherit, just to make sure that all of that's set in stone, and you keep your spouse in that equation as well. But in the overall scope of things, prenuptial agreements are not biblical. When it comes to this law of partnership, first of all, we shouldn't be getting divorced. That should never be coming up to begin with. But if the issues happen where that divorce does happen, because we know life happens, Michelle and I's been divorced, so we know that it does happen, but that does not relieve you of that responsibility for when the next spouse comes along. You know, I don't do a prenuptial on Michelle now just because she's my second wife and try to keep stuff from her.
I'd punch you.
Yeah, so that wouldn't go real well, would it?
No.
So
I'd chase you down.
Yeah, so you should have the same respect and even more so, and the same access to me completely, just as much as the first marriages that we had, or even more so. And so we always have to keep that in mind. So as you consider the issues of oneness in marriage and seek to become one flesh, there's a couple of questions here as we close. Are you completely surrendering to your mate? And is there something that you're holding back and not sharing with them? Also, are you controlling your spouse and not treating them as an equal? Well, if you identify an aspect of your marriage that currently goes against the law of partnership, you need to promptly seek forgiveness from both God and your spouse, take the steps to rectify it. And furthermore, if there is sin in your life, do not expect your spouse to tolerate it. Instead, eliminate it. While it is important to exhibit empathy and kindness towards each other, it is crucial to recognize the detriment impact of sin on any relationship. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 25, it says, "For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me will find it." That's going to do it for this week. Do you have anything else to add to this?
No.
I think we've got it all covered here. Just remember that this partnership is super important. And again, it brings back that equality of the spouses. You both are on level grounds, and you need to make sure that you treat it that way in your marriages.
Yes.
We're going to go ahead and wrap it up for this week. And next week, we're going to be talking about dominant relationships. There's situations out there in marriages where there is a spouse that just dominates the other one, and they think that that's cool. They think that's okay. They don't have any problem with that whatsoever, but God has a huge problem with that. And so for you to get that episode, make sure you subscribe That way you won't miss it. That's going to end this week's episode. I'm Daniel Moore, and Michelle here has been sitting with me here today. Thank you guys so much for listening. This show really wouldn't be possible without you. If you're a fan of the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, or if you'd like to help us out, just take a few seconds to give us a 5-star click, and please subscribe to us on your favorite platform. The links are in the show notes. Well, that's all for this week, and we believe that God's Word never fails us. God's Word has stood the test of time, and through Jesus' death on the cross, He has connected the gap.
You've been listening to Connecting the Gap podcast. In this world, there are many disconnects that cause chaos in our lives. This podcast is birthed from the desire to share hope and restoration of the power of the gospel by being transparent and open in our biblical walk with God. Each week, we take a few moments as we navigate God's Word and peer into other people's testimonies and encourage each other to connect the gap. We upload a new audio podcast every Thursday and a video version of it on YouTube and Rumble. We are also on the Christian podcasting app, Edify. You can subscribe to our podcast on many of the available podcasting platforms, including Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, TuneIn Radio, and more. We are also available on your Alexa-enabled devices. If you would like to contact our ministry for any reason, visit our contact page and send us a message. We hope you are blessed by this ministry. This is a production of Connecting the Gap Ministries.